This lecture is on political theory, political philosophy, and public policy. Now, normative thinking about society occurs at all kinds of different levels of abstraction. The three that interest us primarily in this lecture are political philosophy, political theory, and public policy. So starting with the most abstract level, political philosophy. One way to think about political philosophy is that it tries to identify the moral principles that should govern society. When we're thinking about choosing between principles, it's not clear how much facts really matter. And it's also not clear whether we should consider feasibility constraints at all. All we're trying to do is identify what will be good, right? What will be the best. And when thinking about that, we're free to imagine people as being better than they are. We're free to imagine societies not burdened the way our societies are burdened. Now, stepping down one level of abstraction, we've got political theory. Political theory is the level of regime advocacy. Regime advocacy means here that we are choosing between different ways of organizing society at an abstract level. For example, different kinds of constitutions. We might have a liberal democracy, or a social democracy, or we might have some kind of monarchy, or some kind of communist workers' dictatorship. These are different kinds of regimes, and when considering which regime to adopt, presumably we've already identified some moral principles that are relevant to making that selection. In other words, we need to know something about what values we want to pursue in order to figure out which regimes are going to best fulfill those values. And at this level, general facts do matter. It sort of matters what kind of life people live under, say, a communist dictatorship versus a liberal democracy. And so feasibility constraints are going to become much more apparent when we're thinking about which regimes we should advocate for, because of course regimes exist at a particular time, a particular place, in a particular society. Societies that have legacies of slavery have some kinds of burdens that other kinds of societies don't. And that creates perhaps some considerations when thinking about what kind of regime to advocate for. What kind of constitution, in other words, one should have. Now, moving down a further level of abstraction, we have public policy. Now, the level of public policy is when we campaign for specific laws. So, for instance, laws about how to organize the healthcare market. Many facts from many disciplines will help us determine whether we should, eliminate all private healthcare and have the government take over the healthcare sector, or whether we should have some hybrid mixed regime with some public provision and some private provision, or whether we should leave healthcare entirely to the market. When we're thinking about what kinds of laws we should set forth, many facts are going to matter, right? We need to know what healthcare markets look like. How are they the same and how are they different from other kinds of markets? What do markets do in general? And how do people experience those different kinds of institutions? And so at that level, many facts from many disciplines matter. Here, we're really just trying to select the best possible options from a menu of options, given that we are in a particular regime, given that we have certain restrictions, given that we have certain rights, and so on and so forth. And in these circumstances, there are lots and lots of feasibility constraints. Some kinds of rules will work for some kinds of societies, but not others. In a dictatorship, or a democracy, or in a communist regime, different kinds of public policies are going to be needed because those regimes ultimately set constraints on what's feasible within each of these systems. Now, we could actually go quite a little bit further. We could go further upstream, that is to say more abstract, from political philosophy. You could go up to ethics. Ethics is trying to figure out what the good is in general, not just the political good. And we could even go further upstream from ethics into a realm that philosophers sometimes call axiology, which is simply the study of values in general, not just ethical values, but also things like aesthetics and other kinds of value, everything that might be of value. And so, and again, in those upper realms, facts seem to matter less and less. Now, downstream from public policy, you have something like public administration, or at Austin P, we call it public management. And these are more technical questions about what we should do. How should we allocate resources to particular departments in order to achieve particular public policy goals? What kind of personnel should we hire? What kind of budgets should we set? What kinds of administrative rules and regulations should we have in the distribution of various public policies in order to make healthcare, housing, and other goods more affordable or more readily available once we've decided that that's the public policy that we should adopt? Now, in political science departments, we tend to focus more on theory, philosophy, and policy. That's why this class is set up the way it is. Of course, we have a department of political science and public management at Austin P, but public management has its own ethics course, so we're not going to worry about that. But it's right and proper to note that the boundaries between theory, philosophy, and policies are pretty fuzzy. That is to say, a lot of the times, what's motivating us when asking questions about theory is that we're worried about particular kinds of public policy, or we want to know what kinds of lives people are going to live under different regimes, and so we want to know what kinds of values we should maybe defend in order to get the lives that we want. Again, these questions often tend to blur together, and sometimes what's motivating a question of political theory is really that we want the answer to a particular public policy question. So for instance, we have a very practical question about whether we should legalize marijuana, for instance. That brings in all kinds of theory questions about the limits of government, questions of bodily autonomy, questions of individual rights, questions that are ultimately theory questions that we need to answer before we can get to the public policy question. Generally speaking, though, in this class, we're not going to be examining or debating the foundations of ethics. I might talk a little bit about different ethical foundations, and we're certainly not going to be talking about axiology, which is something that meta-ethicists love to talk about, but that I know almost nothing about. And public administration, again, we're going to leave that to our colleagues in public management, people who study organizational administration. Again, these are normative questions because they do ask questions about what's better and what's worse, where should we allocate resources, where do we get the best bang for our buck, but ultimately that is not what we're going to be addressing in this class. So, I said, generally speaking, the uppermost regions, that is to say the most upstream regions, are the most abstract, where specific facts matter less, and more downstream specific facts tend to matter a whole lot more. So the more into technical issues you go, the more facts matter. So for instance, imagine that you're a state election commission trying to decide whether or not to make voting machines electronic or not. That's going to be a question of public administration. You need to know a lot about information technology and about what current law permits in order to decide whether or not you want to make your voting machines more electronic or not. You need to figure out whether they can be hacked, what the appropriate procedures to secure those machines are going to be, and how many resources it's going to take to do that versus doing it the old-fashioned way with pen and paper. Now, on the other hand, it's really not up to the state election commission to decide whether judges should be elected or appointed. That's a much more political theory-oriented question. It has to do with how we organize societies and the branches of government more generally, and whether or not we elect judges or not, that is to say, who gets to be on the ballot, that's going to be a question at a much higher level of abstraction, which is going to involve some values about what we want out of judges and what we think the role of judges in societies ought to be, and the degree of accountability that they ought to have. Okay, so the reason I'm speaking about issues that are upstream and downstream is that it also kind of lays out an order in which you might want to answer questions. Until you know what counts as a moral value, you can't really know what political institutions you should adopt. You can't tell which institutions are better or worse if you don't have some criteria, some kind of theory that tells you what counts as better or worse. And until you have some kind of constitution defining what your political regime is and what values it's going to defend, it's pretty hard to know which public policy is going to be most consistent with those values. It's very hard to know whether you should have public or private health care if you don't have a constitution telling you what kinds of values your government should pursue. So one mistake that students often make concerns this level of analysis question. They often treat questions of political philosophy as questions of public policy. That is to say, they want to, usually it's that way, not the other way around. They want to treat very abstract questions in much more concrete terms, often because I think my students are much more comfortable coming from a political science background, talking about policy and more concrete things than thinking in terms of abstract principle and generalizable cases. So, but I want to say that if a philosopher asks you about drug policy, they're really asking you a question about values, not a question about costs and benefits to society. Whether or not more tax revenue is going to come in, whether or not, even to some extent, whether or not more crime or less crime is going to happen because of this policy is not really the issue, even though it's an issue that many of my students are quite happy to discuss with me. In order to answer that question on a philosophical level, one must first decide what counts as a cost and what counts as a benefit. Only once we know that can we begin to tally up the numbers, to even know what numbers we should be looking at. And even then, we can only do that if we know that drug policy is really a numbers question, and not a question simply of respect for autonomy, for example. So depending on our values, there might be times where counting costs and benefits is the opposite of what we should do. And that's why I get frustrated sometimes with discussions of public policy, which end up being discussions of cost and benefit. But there are some questions, for instance, about abortion, maybe, where cost and benefit is not really what's at stake. And similarly, some of our more deeply divisive moral issues having to do with the death penalty, having to do with assisted suicide, having to do with fundamental questions of value. It's not about cost and benefit, or at least for a substantial part of the population, it's not about cost and benefit. And to bring cost and benefit into it is already to make certain theoretical assumptions that one side of the debate probably is going to find illegitimate. Okay, so the plan for this course. This way of classifying theory, policy, and philosophy is not the only way to understand the differences between these various enterprises, but it helps to identify different levels of abstraction. It helps us focus our thinking to try to figure out what it is or how it is that we want to think about these issues. Now in this class, we're going to mostly be focusing, like I said, on theory and philosophy. We want to justify regime types. We want to think about what principles should regulate our societies, which ones we should adopt, which ones we should reject, and perhaps how to balance different principles that we both like, but perhaps that don't have the same importance. So we're traveling somewhere between political philosophy and political theory. Now, a word about ideology. Political theory often generates political ideologies. There's not a really big difference between a normative theory and an ideology at the end of the day. Both are trying to persuade you to think about the world in a specific way. I think ideologies perhaps tend to be a little bit more action guiding in ways that theories don't always have to be. Like I said, theories sometimes can be maps. They can specify conceptual relationships. They can hypothesize empirical relationships, but they don't always have to tell you what you should do. Whereas ideologies are almost always both telling you how to see the world and then what to do about the world that you live in. And so you've probably heard of a lot of political ideologies. You've probably heard of conservatism. And again, there's many varieties within each. There's Burkean conservatism, there's more theocratic conservatism, and there's even fascism, which is more reactionary conservatism. You have liberalism in several flavors, including classical liberalism and egalitarian liberalism. You have socialism, but even within socialism, you have varieties. You have democratic socialism, and you have Marxism, which is kind of scientific socialism. And then you have other kinds of ideologies, libertarianism, anarchism, feminism, environmentalism, all of which have their different branches and offshoots, and all of which ultimately are, in some sense, built on a variety of political theories. Some of them are built on the same ones. I prefer to see theories as kind of the building blocks of ideology. That is to say, ideologies use theories to present an attractive worldview to people who might be willing to buy in to that worldview. So one example might be John Locke's theories about government and about private property have inspired many different ideologies. Both liberals, conservatives, and libertarians in the United States, and even some socialists, are inspired by Locke, refer back to Locke, and use Locke's various theories to justify their very different worldviews about how we ought to deal with modern life and modern society. Of course, John Locke is writing largely in a pre-modern society, and so, or what we might call an early modern society, and so we are free to imagine what he would have said about the kind of societies that have evolved since the mid-1600s. But the point here is to note that John Locke provides some of the building blocks, some of the conceptual frameworks in order to think about the way we ought to live together, and all of these different ideologies have found inspiration within John Locke. So that's what I mean by building blocks. Someone like a theorist like John Locke provides some of the building blocks, and then ideologies recombine, interpret, and use those building blocks to ultimately create a more specific blueprint about how to live today, or about how we ought to live today. Now, this course is going to refer to ideologies from time to time, but it's less concerned with ready packaged ideologies and more with the basic ideas, more with the basic building blocks of contemporary political ideologies. So in that sense, you'll be able to, if you want, cobble together your own ideology from these various building blocks, rather than studying sort of prepackaged political philosophies or political ideologies that you either have to accept wholesale or reject wholesale. Now, I will say some of the theorists that you encounter are self-consciously ideological. That is to say, they're trying to operate within a particular ideology. In other words, they're trying to be representatives or articulate the essence of a particular ideology. So someone like Karl Marx is trying to articulate scientific socialism and communism, and it's not just that his writings were appropriated by communists. It's he's working within a particular tradition. He knows he's working within that tradition, and he's trying to further that tradition both intellectually and in political life while he was alive. But in many of the people we'll be studying, you have to be a little bit careful with when you want to apply ideological labels to them, especially to classical thinkers who have never tried to identify with any particular tradition. They are just trying to think about stuff. They're just trying to think about issues, and other people later have tried to put labels on them. But I would be particularly careful about that, and even more so because a lot of our thinkers have changed their mind over time. People like John Stuart Mill, for example, started off as classical liberals, almost libertarians, and ended their lives much more egalitarian, perhaps even somewhat sympathetic to socialism. The point here is that their early writings and their later writings may come into tension. Someone like Machiavelli also has a wide variety of writings, and so we want to be a little bit careful when we study them and when we label them, because it really, which tradition they are closest to probably depends on which book we're reading at that time. And some thinkers have been appropriated in ways that I think they would just hardly be able to recognize. This includes John Locke, who I think would probably not recognize left libertarians who have a very communal idea of property. Someone like Rousseau or someone like Machiavelli. I think Machiavelli's book *The Prince* was said to be on the bedside of Joseph Stalin, and I don't think Machiavelli and Stalin would have gotten along very well at all. Machiavelli was, after all, a Republican Italian, trying to proto-nationalist in a certain sense, trying to unify Italy, and in many ways was a proto-liberal, at least in some of his books. But of course, *The Prince* is written as a very practical, hard-headed way of looking at politics, and that, of course, appealed to a lot of hard-headed dictators later on in time. So we got to be careful not to mix up the thinker himself with the later appropriations of their thoughts and ideas and the way they've been used to justify things that those thinkers probably would never have agreed with in the first place. Okay, in conclusion, this class is going to be conducted, like I said already, at a kind of mid-level, between the upper reaches of philosophy and pure reason, where facts really won't settle any of the questions, and the lowest regions of organizational administration, where pretty much only the facts are relevant. So we're going to be operating in a mid-level, where both facts and values are going to be important to try to answer the questions that we're going to be asking ourselves. So you, practically speaking, before answering an essay or a discussion question, try to think about what level the question is being asked. Is this question about the values we should choose? Is it about the institutions we should adopt? Or is it about particular laws? And think to yourself, how much are facts going to matter? How much are values going to matter? What is it that I'm supposed to be discussing, and at what level am I supposed to be discussing this? And if you don't know, of course, you can always ask, but I think it's interesting to try to figure it out for yourself. And of course, as always, you will want to think about whether there's any controversial words or ideas that are going to need to be explored as concepts before the question can be answered properly. That is to say, you're going to want to see if there's any controversial terms, and the answer might depend on also on how you define those terms. All right, thanks for listening.